The orbital station hung over the blue-white limb of a gas giant like a crown cut from ice, and the arriving shuttles slipped into its bays with a precision that suggested an ancient ritual disguised as traffic control. Jared Perry pressed his palm to the shuttle's viewport and tried to slow his breathing, because on the other side of the docking seal waited the Cathara sequence, the test whispered about in academic forums as if the words themselves could bruise an unguarded mind. He had watched recordings in the dormitory at the academy, grainy captures that never showed the solution because no one had one, only the starts and the breakdowns, the fast calculations that collapsed like houses built on water. He was supposed to feel honored to be here. He felt like a tourist pretending to read a scripture in a tongue he barely understood. The dock hissed, the guide lights blinked green, and the hatchway yawned open with a ceremonial slowness, as if the station measured time differently from ordinary habitats. He walked into air that tasted faintly of copper and ozone, a mix of sterile maintenance and thunderstorm edge, and a procession of cadets from dozens of worlds flowed ahead of him, smooth as a stream moving around an unremarkable stone. He could not help noticing the confidence in the stride of a crystalline Keth who refracted the corridor lights into splinters, or the unblinking stare of a velvet-skinned Rule who whispered equations under his breath like prayer, or the calm poise of a Varine who wore an interpreter mesh that flickered along the ridge of a neck crest in patient patterns. No one stared at him. No one had to. The insignia on his shoulder said human in block letters more legible than any symbol. A steward ushered the cohort into a lift that had no visible controls, only a spherical chamber that pivoted around them so that floor became wall and wall became ceiling, and then gravity let go just long enough to remind each visitor that the station trusted its guests only by increments. When the chamber opened, the hall of the sequence unfolded in a shallow amphitheater of matte black terraces, so wide that the far rail seemed to fall into the gas giant's clouds beyond a transparent dome. In the bowl of the hall hung the puzzle. It did not hang the way chandeliers hang, tethered and obedient. It hovered like a thought that had mass. A lattice of light, color, and shifting geometry breathed in the center of the air, a tangle of translucent ribbons and nested polyhedra that slid through one another without touching. A cat's cradle someone had thrown into the third dimension and then fed through a kaleidoscope. It chimed without sound. It moved without moving. Every piece promised logic, and every motion denied it. Jared felt the old unease climb up his ribs and sit behind his sternum, the tight drumbeat that said he had wandered into a room where excellence was native, and he was not. He tried to catalog the puzzle with the training he owned: graph theory, constraint propagation, multimodal topologies, heuristics for variable ordering, error-correcting codes for pattern stability. His mind laid those tools on an invisible table like scalpel and clamp and forceps, and the lattice smiled back with polite disinterest, because an organism cannot be dissected with a cookbook. A judge spoke from a dais carved into the far terrace, a being whose skin shimmered in slow pulses like a calm heartbeat. The voice arrived through implants as a whisper perfectly tuned to the listener's language. The cadence had no threat in it, which somehow made the message heavier. The rules were simple. The lattice would resist direct calculation. It would mutate to invalidate brute force strategies. It would accept harmony. The hall had no screens to display scores, only the wide silence of an audience trained to feel the shape of cognition as it formed. When the judge lifted a hand, the terraces filled with soft chairs that rose from the floor as if the station grew them for each guest. Jared sat at the edge of his assigned alcove and locked his heels under the support bar to ground himself in something physical, because the lattice was already interested in him, already leaning, already asking questions in a grammar made from movement. A crystalline Keth stepped forward first, shard muscles flowing under facets, and raised two arms in a conductor's stance. Rigid symmetry unspooled from that posture like a fan opening. The lattice responded with a brief curtsy, then broke the pattern with a twist that turned axes into rings. The keth held for 6 seconds, 10, 12, then stopped, breath sinks flashing amber across a chest plate. Applause was not part of the ritual. The Varine tried a spiral decomposition, reading the lattice like a coil that could be unwound with the right counter-rotations. The puzzle accepted that overture for a heartbeat, then inverted orientation and turned spirals into staircases, and the Varine's interpreter mesh dimmed with the quiet of someone hit below armor. A pair of Lissari moved as one, octaves of motion in mirror, and crafted a chord structure that mapped color to interval and shape to tempo, a synesthetic translation elegant enough to be taught in academies. The lattice hummed back and then changed key beyond normal hearing, and the chord cracked like ice under strain. Across the terraces, assistants offered water, salts, eye mists, the gentle kindnesses of a place that had witnessed dizziness and nausea without judgment. Jared swallowed and felt his throat work around air that was suddenly too warm. He knew the pattern of a hall that winnowed and did not pretend it did not, because he had sat in labs where scholarships evaporated from faces that deserved them, and where gifts hid under loud talent and never found light. He watched and took notes he would not read later, because this was not an exam in the way he understood exams. It was a room asked to watch minds reach and then see who could keep reaching while the rules whispered that the problem did not love effort. His mind reached for anchors because anchors kept a person distinguishable from the sea. He remembered a kitchen where sunlight found table varnish in narrow golds, a kettle that steamed like a small locomotive, a tin that held crochet hooks that clicked against one another as a hand rummaged for the right size. He did not linger there. He could not afford to swim in a memory when an ocean of moving angles waited to drown him. He forced attention back to the hall. A rule cadet traced the lattice's edges with a beam that registered phase shift, an elegant scientific approach that would have made any professor proud. Numbers bloomed in a halo above the cadet's wrist device, ranks of data as fine as lace, and the lattice shrugged and added new edges in dimensions the device could not measure. The rule blinked sweat into an eye and bowed out. The judge's hand fell, and a murmur moved like wind through a meadow that had no grass. It was Jared's turn row by row, a slow geometry of fairness that stacked names until his name found the lip of the terrace and tipped into the air. He stood and felt his knees tell truths that bravado never tells, truths about posture and small tremors and the weight of attention that gathers like dust on a lens. He walked to the rail and into the clear floor of the bowl where the puzzle hung, and the station's shielding darkened the dome just enough to turn the gas giant into a pale pupil that watched everyone without blinking. The lattice drifted closer. He could feel nothing in his skin, no breeze or heat, only a crispness in the air that entered his lungs as if the station had skimmed impurities out of the atmosphere to make thought travel faster. He lifted his hands without meaning to lift them, palms open the way a person faces a nervous dog, and the lattice slowed its churn as if the motion of a human hand could be a subject worth consideration. He tried to begin with mathematics, because every reflex trained in classrooms begged him to. Constraint satisfaction usually meant pick the tightest variable and assign values with minimal branching, prune aggressively, monitor conflicts, backtrack with grace. He saw variables in color, in width, in loop count, in rotational velocity. He saw that each choice caused a mutation that changed the meaning of the last choice. Backtracking in a city where streets move is not backtracking. It is walking home on a floor that retiles itself to turn corridor into wall. He felt sweat make a slow map down his spine. He listened to a heartbeat he had known since childhood, steady because a childhood heartbeat has to be steady to carry a growing person through hours of trying, failing, trying again. The judge said nothing. No countdown ticked through his ear. The lattice waited with the patience of a planet. The hall felt suddenly smaller, as if the terraces had leaned in. He counted breaths, not numbers. He found the inhale that lived under panic and asked it to stay. He let the eyes do what eyes have always done when words do not help. Follow motion. Trace edge. Notice where a loop returns to itself and where it pretends to return before sneaking out of a plane and into another. A piece near the center braided through 3 rings like a trick knot a sailor might teach a nephew and then laugh when fingers fumbled on the second pass. He knew the joke was not malign. The puzzle had no malice. It had an appetite for patterns and a distaste for force. He lowered his hands and raised them again at a different angle and noticed how the chroma shifted when a line met another at a non-integer ratio, a whisper that spoke in color where algebra would have placed a mark on a page. He became aware of the way his fingers had fallen into a rhythm that did not come from academy drills at all, a small looping motion like charting the path of a hook through a stitch. His mind offered the picture with the care of a friend who knows a memory might help or might ruin the moment. He saw a couch that had seen better days and a woman whose hair had been pinned up with an economy that meant business, and he saw yarn pull from a skein into a universe constructed one loop at a time. He did not lean into that image. He let it sit near the edge of attention like a lighthouse in fog. The lattice pulsed in gentle rebuttal to a tentative attempt he made with an angular rotation, as if to say that the world would not confess itself to a man who arrived with a hammer when the universe asked for open hands. He lowered his arms, not in defeat, but in recalibration, and exhaled until his ribs softened. He told himself the thing a coach once told him after a sprint that hurt more than it should have. The body must stop lying before the mind can tell the truth. He had to stop pretending he understood the form simply because a syllabus told him what difficult looked like. Difficult did not look like this. This was familiar in a way that embarrassed him, because he had been trying to pretend he was here to perform an exotic science when the structure in front of him had recognitions tucked into corners like notes from an old friend. The judge did not clear a throat. No one groaned in impatience. The hall understood that the first minute for a new mind is the only minute that matters, because the first minute is where a person chooses which door to try. He felt that choice arrive. He did not choose yet. He let the choice stand next to him and wait, because rushing a choice is a way to flinch. He met the lattice's steady drift with a stillness that was not surrender. He thought about lines that cross and do not bind, loops that slip under and over without snagging, tension that must live in a strand so that a pattern can hold when a hand lifts it off a table. He did not name those thoughts out loud. He did not give the hall the theater of a lecture. He gave himself the dignity of silence. The lattice shifted again, not to taunt him, but to keep its promise. Nothing lazy would hold. He nodded once, a small motion that acknowledged a contract neither party had spoken. The chapter of his life that had marched under the banner of pure calculation lowered its flag enough to admit another banner might belong on the field. He was not ready to solve. He was ready to look with different eyes. He set his stance, rolled his shoulders back, and let his hands fall into a rhythm that matched breath rather than procedure, and the station seemed to lean in the way a room leans when a story reaches the line where everything after will either matter or vanish. He had not found an answer. He had found the edge of a language he had learned before he knew what a language was, and the puzzle breathed as if it had heard a word it recognized. The moment Jared lowered his arms, the lattice seemed to sense his hesitation, as if it could taste the doubt hanging in the air like static before a storm. The surrounding terraces remained utterly still. No one spoke, no one shuffled, no one coughed. The audience's silence was as deliberate as the puzzle's slow churn. He knew that in this hall, every pause could be interpreted as either a sign of deep strategy or the first slip into collapse. His pulse was still fast, but there was a change. Less the pounding of panic, more the relentless thrum of concentration forced into a narrow path. He could feel his own breathing settling into an unhurried rhythm, the kind that allowed thoughts to pass in full shape rather than in fractured bursts. The other cadets had used their turns to make bold gestures, rapid manipulations meant to bend the lattice toward their will before it could adapt. Watching them had been like seeing climbers try to reach a summit in one desperate push, exhausting themselves before the true climb even began. Jared, now standing alone before the puzzle, knew that if he tried the same approach, he would meet the same fate. He needed a foothold, something small, something that would anchor him in this shifting environment before he could risk pulling the structure into alignment. He started by following a single strand of light, one thread that arced through the heart of the puzzle. It glowed a pale amber, weaving through translucent bands and vanishing behind a shell of geometry before emerging again, transformed into a warmer gold. He tracked its movement, noting each point where it intersected another strand, each moment where the lattice seemed to breathe and adjust around it. At first, this focus felt absurd. The puzzle was massive, a web of countless threads and shapes, and here he was, staring at one thread like a child following the line of a kite string. But as his eyes traced the loops, a memory began to tug at the edge of his mind. A shape not of numbers or equations, but of patterns repeating in deliberate, rhythmic ways. He blinked to clear the image, yet it only sharpened. The loops in the lattice mirrored the loops he had once seen in yarn, tight, consistent stitches that locked together to form something whole. He remembered sitting cross-legged on the floor of his grandmother's living room, his gaze fixed on the way her fingers manipulated the crochet hook. She never looked rushed. Each loop was pulled through with care, each stitch resting perfectly against the last. The strands in front of him now had the same inevitability, the same quiet precision. For a brief moment, he felt foolish for making the connection. This was a galactic mental trial that had broken the most brilliant alien minds in the sector, and he was thinking about yarn. But the more he studied the puzzle, the more the comparison refused to leave. The structure didn't simply connect points randomly, it looped back on itself, twisted into tight knots that looked complex from afar, but were, up close, sequences of repeated motions. These repetitions were not arbitrary. They carried the same logic as a pattern in crochet, where certain stitches had to appear in the right order to give the piece strength and shape. Jared began moving his hands, not to manipulate the lattice directly, but to mimic the motions he remembered from those afternoons in the living room. Hook through loop, pull through, chain one, turn. Even without touching the puzzle, his fingers formed the rhythm in the air, each gesture a ghost of something long past. He felt his shoulders loosen as the muscle memory crept in. His gaze no longer darted around the lattice, searching for mathematical openings. Instead, he allowed his eyes to flow with the stitches in the structure, noting where the sequence broke and where it continued seamlessly. He noticed that the lattice seemed to respond, not in any dramatic shift, but in the way it slowed its changes when his movements matched its own rhythm. It was almost imperceptible, but the threads he followed no longer slipped away quite so quickly. It was as if the puzzle recognized that he was no longer forcing his will upon it, but working alongside its natural form. The concept made sense in the context of crochet. Pulling too hard on the yarn ruined the tension, while keeping the right slack allowed the pattern to form naturally. The judge on the dais did not intervene. The audience leaned forward ever so slightly, sensing something different in the human's approach. To most of them, his subtle hand motions looked strange, perhaps even meaningless, but a few of the older alien scholars exchanged glances, as if they had seen this sort of quiet cooperation before. In art, in music, in crafts that survived generations because they carried more than technique. They carried memory. Jared's eyes remained locked on the thread he had chosen. He let it guide him to a small section of the puzzle that appeared stable, 3 loops intertwined with a diamond-shaped frame. He studied the connections, noting that 2 of the loops mirrored each other exactly, while the third differed by a single twist. In crochet, such a difference would indicate either an intentional pattern break or a mistake that needed to be corrected before it spread through the entire piece. Without thinking, he reached toward the puzzle and adjusted the twist. The change was subtle, but undeniable. The diamond frame brightened fractionally, and the loops aligned more cleanly. For the first time since entering the hall, Jared felt the faintest spark of triumph. He had made the smallest possible adjustment, yet the entire structure seemed to settle in that section. It wasn't a victory, far from it. but it was proof that he had found a language the puzzle understood. Encouraged, he looked for another section with similar tension. He found one on the opposite side, a tangle of loops that almost matched but were misaligned by what, in his grandmother's work, would have been the equivalent of skipping a stitch. He corrected it with the same delicate movement, watching as the loops slipped into harmony and the surrounding strands relaxed. It occurred to him that the puzzle's defense mechanism, its constant mutations, might be less aggressive in areas where the tension was right, just as yarn behaved better when stitched evenly. But his progress did not go unnoticed by the puzzle itself. As soon as he made his third correction, the lattice pulsed sharply, and several strands shifted out of reach, as if testing whether his technique could adapt to a faster tempo. His fingers hesitated for only a second before falling back into the rhythm. Hook through loop, pull through, chain, turn. He moved not with the frantic precision of someone solving equations, but with the patience of someone mending something delicate. He could sense the change in the air, less hostility, more curiosity. The lattice no longer felt like a predator waiting for him to misstep, but like a wary animal deciding whether to trust the hand reaching toward it. He kept his breathing steady, each inhale and exhale syncing with the imaginary stitches. The hall around him faded into irrelevance. The judge's presence, the silent crowd, the unblinking stars beyond the dome, all of it became background to the simple, repetitive motions that felt as natural as breathing. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had a way of dissolving in this state of focus. By the time Jared paused, several small sections of the puzzle glowed faintly, their loops and shapes holding steady against the surrounding chaos. He knew it was not enough to complete the sequence, but it was enough to matter. He had found an opening where others had only found walls. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the memory of his grandmother's voice rose, not in words, but in the rhythm of her hands. The unspoken lesson that patience could turn a loose strand into something strong enough to last for years. That rhythm now pulsed through his own movements, carrying him deeper into the puzzle's shifting heart. He was not solving it yet. He was earning its permission to try. The faintly glowing sections within the lattice felt like small islands of calm in an otherwise restless ocean. Jared knew that these were not final answers, but footholds. Places where the pattern held steady enough for him to build outward. He also knew that the puzzle would not leave him to work in peace. The Cathara sequence was infamous for its ability to shift in response to progress, adapting like a living mind determined to preserve its own mystery. The soft luminescence of the stabilized loops was his invitation to go deeper, but it was also the puzzle's way of marking him as an active threat. As he reached for the next section, the lattice reacted with more intent than before. The once subtle ripples became deliberate waves, folding and twisting the surrounding geometry so that the glowing areas were no longer aligned with one another. It was as if the puzzle had decided to test whether his newfound method could work under pressure, whether the quiet patience of his approach could hold up against sudden, chaotic disruption. His first instinct was to fight against the movement, to force the structure to return to the arrangement he had just established. But the moment he attempted to push back, the tension in the loops hardened, the strands resisting in a way that felt almost hostile. He stopped. The sensation reminded him of a moment from years ago when he had tugged too sharply on a row of stitches in his grandmother's work and felt the entire line tighten, threatening to ruin the piece. He had learned then that force was the enemy of flow, and the lesson came back to him now with the weight of necessity. Instead of trying to bend the lattice back to its prior form, he let it move, adjusting his hands to follow its lead rather than resist it. His gestures shifted from linear corrections to spirals and soft arcs, imitating the way yarn could be guided back into place by working with its natural twist. This change in approach yielded something unexpected. As he followed the motion instead of resisting it, he began to see connections between sections that had seemed unrelated before. The glowing islands were not separate victories. They were anchor points in a larger, hidden structure. The strands between them, though dim and shifting, shared certain repeats, small sequences of loops that were identical in spacing and tension. These repeats were so well hidden within the chaos that he would have missed them entirely if he had kept focusing only on the immediate area in front of him. He began to travel along these hidden sequences, mentally tracing them from one glowing section to another. It felt like moving along a barely visible trail through a forest, subtle markers only someone attuned to them could follow. Each time he reached a new point on the trail, he made a small adjustment to the local tension, and the loops would align just enough to begin glowing. Slowly, the puzzle began to reveal that the chaotic changes were not random at all. They were more like a loom shifting its frame to hide the true weave, waiting to see if the weaver would notice the pattern beneath. The judge on the dais leaned forward ever so slightly, and though Jared did not dare look away from his work, he felt the weight of that gaze. The judge knew something was happening. So did the audience. He could feel the subtle change in the room's energy, the collective awareness that the human was doing something none of the other cadets had tried. But the puzzle was far from surrendering. The moment Jared linked a fourth glowing section to the others, the lattice surged in complexity. The threads multiplied, some splitting into thinner strands while others fused into thick cables that obscured his view of the underlying loops. It was a defense mechanism, meant to overwhelm him by increasing the sheer volume of elements to track. For a few seconds, he lost sight of the hidden trail entirely, swallowed up in the sudden density of the weave. He closed his eyes. It was a risk. Most competitors in the sequence kept their gaze fixed at all times, terrified of losing visual contact with the shifting mass. But Jared knew that staring into the chaos would only let it dictate his pace. With his eyes shut, he let his hands move in the old rhythm again, the motions he had committed to muscle memory long before he ever dreamed of standing in this hall. Hook through loop, pull through, chain, turn. He imagined the yarn's weight between his fingers, the gentle drag that told him whether the tension was right. In his mind, the lattice became softer, less an impossible machine and more a piece of work in progress, something that could be guided if treated with care. When he opened his eyes again, the chaotic density had not vanished, but it no longer looked impenetrable. The thicker strands and thinner threads were not barriers. They were structural layers, like the front and back stitches in crochet that could be worked independently to create depth. By focusing on one layer at a time, he could slip his adjustments through without disturbing the others. It was slower work, but it was steady, and the lattice seemed almost surprised by his refusal to be rushed. One by one, the glowing sections began to merge. The faint trails between them brightened, forming a loose network across the puzzle. It was not complete. Large areas still swirled in resistance, but it was the first time he could truly see the possibility of the entire structure aligning. His approach had turned the sequence from a purely adversarial opponent into something almost cooperative, though he knew it could change its mind at any moment. Then came the first real sign of acknowledgement. Near the core of the lattice, where the threads were most complex, a single loop shifted of its own accord into perfect alignment without his touch. It was as if the puzzle had made the move for him, an unspoken gesture that said, "I see what you are doing." The glow from that loop spread outward in a thin ring before fading back to normal, but Jared understood the message. This was no longer just a test of logic. It was a conversation. Encouraged, he worked faster, guided less by calculation and more by instinct, honed from hours of watching his grandmother's hands transform loose yarn into intricate patterns. He began to anticipate the puzzle's moves, adjusting a strand just before it shifted, easing a loop into place at the exact moment the surrounding tension softened. The rhythm was intoxicating, a blend of memory and presence that made him forget the audience entirely. By the time he stepped back slightly to gauge his progress, nearly half of the lattice was interconnected in stability. It was not yet the perfect pattern the sequence demanded, but it was closer than he had imagined possible when he first walked into the hall. The challenge now would be to maintain this fragile harmony while moving into the most unstable regions of the weave, the places where no one had ever managed to hold the pattern long enough to finish. He knew the next stage would test more than his technique. The puzzle had begun to trust him, but trust could be broken with one wrong move. Every adjustment from here on would have to be precise, deliberate, and patient. The faint hum in the hall told him that everyone watching understood it too. He wasn't just another competitor anymore. He was the one who had found a way to make the puzzle listen. The moment Jared began working toward the unstable core, the lattice shifted in a way that felt deliberate, almost like a narrowing of eyes before a decisive move. The threads near the center thickened, twisting around each other into knots so intricate that they seemed to defy any logical start point. He had expected resistance, but this was different. It felt like the puzzle was deliberately hiding the pathways he had been following, folding them under extra layers so that only fragments peeked through. The warm glow he had spread through the outer sections dimmed here, as if the heart of the sequence existed in a different light altogether. He took a single slow breath, grounding himself before stepping closer. The peripheral sections remained stable, humming softly with the tension he had set earlier. But he knew that if he pulled too hard on any part of the core, those sections could unravel instantly. His hands hovered in the air, just shy of touching the central knots, fingers twitching slightly as he tried to read the direction of the twist without disturbing it. In crochet, certain knots were intentional, decorative even, while others were accidents that had to be undone carefully before the entire pattern warped. The problem here was that the sequence offered no visual distinction between the two. Every loop could be either a trap or a necessary stitch. His instinct told him to find the weakest point first, the loop where the tension was uneven. In his grandmother's work, that was often the place where the yarn had been pulled tighter than the rest, creating a slight distortion that disrupted the flow. Here, he spotted a thread that shimmered faintly against the others, not quite in sync with their pulsing rhythm. He reached for it slowly, adjusting his touch until the tension softened under his movement. The surrounding knots reacted subtly, loosening just enough to expose a hidden crossing beneath. It was not an open path, not yet, but it was an entry. He began working the surrounding loops, easing them apart in a rhythm that echoed the earlier sections, though here the resistance was stronger. Every adjustment demanded precision. Even the smallest overcorrection risked snapping the delicate balance that kept the outer pattern intact. He worked in spirals now, widening his reach outward from each small victory, creating pockets of stability that could serve as anchors if the lattice surged again. The puzzle was no longer purely resisting him. It was adapting. At moments, it seemed to anticipate his movements, adjusting in ways that tested whether he could maintain his rhythm without losing control. Twice, he had to stop entirely and let the structure reset itself before continuing, because he could feel it tightening under his hands in warning. In those pauses, he would step back, breathe, and observe, letting the pattern show him where it wanted to be worked next. As the minutes stretched, he began to sense something beyond the mechanics of the weave, an underlying symmetry hidden deep in the core. It was not visible in the way the threads crossed, but in the timing of their shifts, as if the lattice was breathing in a pattern. He realized that the sequence of tension changes matched certain stitch repeats from a blanket his grandmother had made years ago, one that alternated complex designs with rows of simple grounding stitches. It was an odd thing to notice here, but once he did, he could not unsee it. Following that rhythm, he began pairing complex adjustments with simple ones, alternating between intricate knot releases and basic tension alignments. The effect was immediate. The core's frantic movement slowed, and several of the thickest knots began to unravel on their own, exposing loops that connected directly to his earlier stabilized sections. The glow spread inward, faint at first, then steadily brighter as the core began to harmonize with the outer layers. But the sequence was not finished testing him. Just as he connected a major inner loop to the network, the lattice shifted the entire structure, rotating the core while keeping the outer sections fixed. It was a disorienting move, like having a half-finished blanket suddenly flipped in his hands so that every angle was unfamiliar. For a moment, he almost lost the thread of the pattern entirely, the disconnection jarring enough to break his rhythm. He closed his eyes again, feeling for the tension rather than relying on sight. In this new orientation, he had to trust his hands completely. His fingers found the familiar loops by touch, moving through them as if reading Braille, seeking the places where the the threads, pulled against him. Bit by bit, he rebuilt the pathways, adjusting to the puzzle's attempt to throw him off balance. When he opened his eyes, the alignment was still there, fragile but holding. The judge remained silent, but Jared could feel the weight of the observation pressing on him. He knew that the audience could see how close he was to integrating the core fully, but they could also see how easily it could collapse. Sweat gathered at the base of his neck, and his arms ached from holding them steady for so long, but he pushed past the discomfort. The work demanded patience, not speed. The breakthrough came when he noticed that one of the inner loops, so deeply buried in the core it seemed untouchable, was in fact a master loop, a single stitch that, if aligned, would draw the rest of the core into harmony. In crochet, it was the kind of loop that joined rounds, the silent pivot that kept the pattern coherent. He approached it with almost ceremonial care, adjusting the surrounding tension first so that the loop could move freely without pulling its neighbors out of place. Then, with the smallest shift of his fingers, he set it into perfect alignment. The effect was immediate and breathtaking. The core brightened in a wave, each knot unspooling into balanced loops that connected seamlessly to the glowing network outside. The lattice's movement slowed to a gentle pulse, no longer chaotic, no longer defensive. For the first time, Jared felt that the sequence was not resisting him at all. It was moving with him, as though the two of them were working toward the same goal. But he also knew that the sequence's final challenge would come next. The puzzle had shown him its heart, and in doing so, it had given him both the greatest opportunity and the greatest risk. One wrong move could undo everything he had built. The perfect pattern was close now, close enough that he could almost see the final form emerging in the air before him. All that remained was to unify the last unstable sections without breaking the trust the sequence had at last begun to offer. Jared stood before the lattice, the hum of the stabilized core still resonating faintly in the air like the last note of a well-played chord. The hardest part was yet to come. The outer and inner sections were connected, but there remained a scattering of unstable zones along the midsection, patches where the loops shifted irregularly, slipping in and out of harmony. These zones acted like stubborn gaps in a nearly complete blanket, places where the pattern threatened to unravel unless closed with absolute precision. He could feel the sequence watching him now, not in the hostile way it had before, but in a way that felt almost expectant, as though it was giving him the chance to prove that he could finish what he had started. He began with the section nearest the core, his hands moving in steady arcs as he adjusted each loop's tension. In crochet, the final rows often determined whether the piece would hold its shape for years or collapse into warped fabric, and this principle guided him now. He avoided making large corrections, instead applying tiny, almost imperceptible shifts that encouraged the surrounding threads to align on their own. The sequence responded with surprising cooperation, threads settling faster than before, as if the puzzle itself had grown accustomed to his touch. As he worked, he realized that each unstable zone had its own personality. One section was loose and prone to drifting out of alignment unless constantly guided, while another was rigid, resisting adjustment until he softened the tension in multiple surrounding loops first. This variety reminded him of his grandmother's scrap projects, where she would work with mismatched yarns, some smooth, some coarse, and adapt her technique to match the material's temperament. It was not about imposing a single method. It was about knowing when to lead and when to follow. He moved carefully through the midsection, linking each stabilized patch to the nearest glowing segment. With each connection, the light within the lattice grew warmer, spreading in veins until the unstable areas were reduced to just two isolated zones. These final gaps were the most difficult yet. The first was entangled with a cluster of decorative loops, ornamental flourishes that served no structural purpose but were interwoven tightly enough to make any adjustment risky. The second was a narrow band of thin, delicate threads that trembled visibly whenever he touched a nearby section. He decided to address the delicate band last. The ornamental cluster came first, and for that, he employed the same patience he had seen in his grandmother when untangling a skein. He eased the loops apart slowly, working from the outside inward, always ensuring that each move left the surrounding structure intact. It took far longer than he expected, but at last, the cluster loosened enough for him to align the core loops beneath it. The ornamental strands settled back in place, their positions unchanged, yet now perfectly balanced within the overall pattern. The final zone was another matter entirely. The thin threads here behaved like the finest lace. Any sudden pull could snap the structure. He tested the tension with the gentlest of touches, noting how the vibrations traveled through the band and into the surrounding loops. If he had tried to correct this earlier in the process, it would have been impossible. But now, with the rest of the lattice stable, the threads had nowhere to slip to. The sequence had left this as the last step deliberately, a final examination of whether he had learned to respect the structure as much as control it. His hands hovered over the band, fingers tracing the air just above the strands. He began to work in micro-adjustments, altering the angle of each loop by barely visible degrees. The changes were so subtle that the audience might not have noticed them at all, but within the lattice, the effect was profound. The tension across the band evened out, the trembling ceased, and a faint glow began to seep through the delicate threads. The moment the final loop slid into place, the light surged outward in a brilliant wave, cascading across the entire puzzle from core to edge. The sequence froze in perfect alignment. Every loop, every knot, every strand held steady, glowing with the unified harmony of the perfect pattern. It was not just beautiful. It was alive with a quiet completeness, the kind that made every previous moment of chaos feel like it had been necessary to reach this point. Jared lowered his hands slowly, as if not to disturb the balance, though he knew that now nothing could undo it. The hall was silent for a heartbeat, as though even the air needed to absorb what had just happened. Then, the glow dimmed to a steady, soft radiance, and the judge on the dais rose. There were no formal declarations of victory here, no banners or fanfares. Instead, the sequence itself gave the recognition, a final pulse of warm light that seemed to wrap around him before fading away entirely. The lattice dissolved into a shimmer of particles, drifting upward until they vanished into the dome above. Jared stood in the empty space where the puzzle had been, his breathing deep and steady. He felt no surge of pride, no urge to bask in triumph, only a deep, grounding sense of having completed something in the exact way it was meant to be completed. The audience's silence broke into a low murmur, then into scattered applause, growing until it filled the hall. But for him, the true acknowledgement had already happened in the puzzle's final silent gesture. As he turned to leave the center of the hall, he caught sight of a reflection in the transparent dome, the gas giant beyond, its swirling bands calm and steady. The sight reminded him of afternoons spent watching his grandmother finish a piece, smoothing it out across her lap with quiet satisfaction. It was never about showing it off. It was about knowing the work was right. Walking back toward his place on the terrace, he understood that the sequence had not been about solving a problem in the traditional sense. It had been about listening, about seeing the structure for what it wanted to be rather than what he thought it should be. The memory of yarn between his fingers would always be with him, but now it carried something more, a proof that even in the farthest corners of the galaxy, the smallest human memories could bridge the widest gaps, turning the incomprehensible into something that could be held, shaped, and completed. And as the doors of the hall closed behind him, he felt that the puzzle had left him with one last unspoken truth. The most complex patterns often began with the simplest loop, and the hands that knew how to make it could change far more than a piece of thread.